Well, Dr. Ann Hollifield, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a treat to talk to you. I knew you as a student in your honors course at the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Georgia. It's been a couple years since then, and it's always great to catch up. So thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Jennifer. Thank you for inviting me. And it's always a delight not only to keep up with you, but also to look at all the wonderful things you're doing in journalism.
Talk to me for a minute just about the breadth of your research and what you have spent your time on over the years.
Well, my research has followed a couple of different paths that are relevant to our discussion today. One is on news media sustainability, and I've done research on that across the globe, looking at all kinds of different what news organizations need to survive and thrive and produce high quality journalism that supports democracy, that fights government corruption, and that sustains businesses and economic development. And I've looked at that under all kinds of different media systems and different regulatory systems. The other area is I've looked at how communication affects rural community development and sustainability. And I spent quite a few years in the 80s and 90s, and actually early part of the century, gathering data on American rural communities and the role that media and telecommunications, the internet, played in their ability to thrive.
You know, I go back to the fundamentals that many of them I learned from you about this business. And as I've gone on in life and talked to people, I realize these aren't things that everybody's taught. How does journalism work? And so we're going to start with some really basic definitions, some of them that are super simple on the surface and yet incredibly complex. And so I'll throw one of those at you right away, which is, what is the media? We keep hearing this term, the media, thrown around. What does that mean, and what are the nuances there?
That is an incredibly difficult question to answer in 2021, because what the media are has changed dramatically in the digital age. So it's the place that I always start is there's a difference between the media and the news media. And that I think we're at a point where those terms, it's not helpful to use them interchangeably. So the media encompasses anything that is entertainment, and it really is platform agnostic. It can be magazines, it can be newsletters, it can be video or YouTube or social media, or any number of things. All of those things I would call the media. The news media are something else. They are sources that focus on fact and evidence-based information that is verifiable and that provides information that people can use for decision making and to manage their own lives.
Of course, the first decade plus of my career was in local TV news. Why is it important to make that distinction that you just made and to talk about media in these kind of two realms?
That's an excellent question. And I think the reason is because the sustainability, the viability of these two different types of media are no longer linked together. They're quite different. And a lot of it has to do with human psychology. We know that people are willing to pay a great deal more for what they want as opposed to what they need. So consequently, the economics of news and information media have diverged greatly in the last 20 years from the economics of entertainment media.
So when it comes to the news media side of those two columns you were talking about, we know that there are traditional local channels we tune into for broadcast news, and then there's cable news networks that are nationwide. Talk to me about the historic differences and how they both originated.
Well, there are two key differences. One is the business model, and the other is the target audience, and how that then affects the content that the news source focuses on. The business model is that on anything that's on cable, the cable networks, they have a dual revenue stream. They receive subscription income from you through the payment that you make to your cable company for your cable subscription. In contrast, the local television stations and even the national broadcast networks do not have any subscription income at all traditionally. They are 100% dependent on advertising revenue and a few other sources of income that are very minor in the scheme of things and are very technical. The other aspect that's very different is that your local television news station primarily gets its advertising revenue from local advertisers. And so, and it also is serving a local area. So it focuses on producing content that is of interest and relevant to its audience, which is in a limited geographic area. Whereas the cable networks are producing news for a national or international audience, and therefore the range of content and stories that they cover differs.
Historically, there is an additional expectation that local news would provide certain services for their community. There was regulation and is regulation by the FCC. Can you explain that a little bit for folks?
Yes. Broadcast is regulated very differently from cable, which also plays a role in shaping what you do and don't see in news on cable news and versus broadcasting. Historically, television and radio were regulated on the principle that a licensee had to anybody who was going to receive a television or radio license to broadcast in the area had to be of demonstrably high moral standing, and they were required to broadcast for the public interest, convenience, and necessity of the community to which they were licensed. And every few years when their license came up for renewal, they actually had to prove that they had done that. Unfortunately, in the era of deregulation, starting from the late 1970s through 80s, that has become more or less a paper tiger, and the FCC no longer seriously looks at that. And the consequence of that is you see less and less content produced that is of specific interest to the local areas that are being served. That's one reason why radio stations, for example, have largely given up producing local news. They don't have to anymore in order to prove that they're serving the public interest, convenience, and necessity of their local community in order to get their license renewed on a regular basis. So that's one way regulation has affected. There's another way regulation affects broadcasting, and that is that the broadcasting has always been seen as a very important national security technology, that there has to be a way that in cases of national emergency, the government can communicate with us, both from the federal, state, and local level, that you can be warned that there's a tornado or a hurricane or a flood coming your way, that you can receive news and information that makes you a citizen. And consequently, the federal government has always believed that every citizen has a right to receive broadcast signals and they shouldn't have to pay for it. And there's another element of it, and that is that the public airwaves are a public resource. We all actually own them because they belong to the government, or that has historically been the case, but only a few people can use them. And so consequently, that was also the root of that sense that the people who were allowed to make money off using what is a public resource ought to have to serve the public in return. But as I said, that kind of philosophy has really eroded in the last 50 years. But the notion that we have to have a way of communicating with each other, that everybody should be able to have access to that, whether they're rich or poor, is also the reason why broadcasting is something you haven't had to pay to subscribe to. Whereas with cable, it's a optional technology. You have to pay for it. Therefore, they are not regulated as strictly on things like obscenity and content, because if you don't like what they're doing, you can always cancel your subscription. Whereas in broadcast, there's a need for it to be in your home so that you can get information of national importance and national emergency, national security, and consequently, you should be able to have content in your home that doesn't offend you or threaten your family or your children or whatever. And so there are different content regulations as well.
It's surprising to me how few folks realize that you can still get free broadcast television. I had rabbit ears until a few months ago. Now the antennas look a little more modern, but you can still get that free broadcast local news access. And that's what you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. You certainly can. And there are, to some degree, some of those regulations are still in effect, even though they're not nearly as stringent as they were years ago. But yes, there's still the sense that you ought to be confident that you can turn on your television and have content that isn't going to be just openly and aggressively offensive.
one of the things that seemed to be really confusing to folks when I was a reporter is, you know, I worked for an NBC station that was owned by a company based out of Alabama. And then I worked for a Fox station that wasn't owned by Fox News Corporation. How do you explain the ownership model in TV, including O&O, but also just, you know, what most people probably experience in their local news?
There is a big difference between ownership and network affiliation. So, and if that is the way the American broadcast system was set up. There are some television stations, mostly in major cities such as Los Angeles and New York, where the local affiliate station that carries the broadcast network's content, like ABC, NBC, CBS, is actually owned by that network. It's a subsidiary of a subsidiary that owns a series of television stations. But the majority of television stations across America, local television stations, are actually owned by companies that have little, if anything, to do with the networks. And they simply have a contract to carry the network signal into the local broadcast market so that they are what's called an affiliate of the network. And so most of the stations in Atlanta are affiliates of the networks, but they're not owned by the network. And so if you have a network that has a particular point of view, that might come through in the network's content, but it's not necessarily going to come through in the station's local news, which the station produces entirely independently of the network.
Why is it that TV stations are based in larger cities? Talk to me about the technology, but also the business model that birthed these DMAs.
The broadcast system in the United States reflects the geography of the United States, which is quite different from other areas of the world, such as Europe. Our geography is immense compared to most countries, and broadcast signals can only travel so far before they degrade so much that your televisions can't pick them up and deliver to you any kind of a picture that you can watch. Consequently, the broadcast networks, which produce or buy so much of the content, can't get their content, or historically in the era of broadcast could not get physically deliver their content to you in Atlanta or San Francisco or Los Angeles. The signals wouldn't travel that far. So what they had to do was they had to have a local television station with a local broadcast tower. They would transmit the content to that station. The station would broadcast it through its tower, and the signal would fall on the local viewers in whatever town you were in. And the DMA designation, or the city, defines the geographic area over which the local broadcast tower can throw a signal that can be watched. Okay, so that's the technical end of it. The other part, answer to your question, is finances. A small town cannot support financially through advertising the cost of running a television station. It can a radio station, because a radio station is much less expensive to operate, but not a television station. And there's simply not a large enough audience. The audience is not affluent enough to attract enough advertisers who are willing to pay enough to pay the bills to keep a television station on the air. So that's why TV stations are primarily located in large areas. And as you move out into large cities, and as you move out into smaller and smaller towns, you might find one television station, but you won't find 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 9 as there are in the big cities.